Before we can apply tone to a drawing, we need a drawing to apply it to. So here's a drawing I made of one of the Christopher Wren churches in London, which was bombed out during the Blitz, but has been kept as a feature. I'm drawing the spire here. With spires, it's really important to get them straight. Nothing looks more precarious than a leaning spire. And then the lower half, there are lots of decisions to be made about this brickwork and how much texture I'll show and get the pedestrians in. There's a tree, large tree behind it, as well as a streetscape to include. Personally, I really enjoy putting foliage around architecture because I think it's a lovely contrast. And originally I wasn't going to apply tone to this drawing, so I've probably put a little bit more line in the hatching than I ordinarily would, because I wanted to bring the contrast out with the line alone. But I've decided to use this drawing now to demonstrate the use of sketch marker tone and using the Copic sketch markers in particular. We have our drawing now, but I find a very good practice is not to jump straight into it with our markers, but to have another look at the reference and work out exactly what it is we're trying to do. So here's our photo. I like many things about this scene, but my question now is, if I'm going to be adding sketch marker tone to the line work, what is it that I'm trying to bring out? What are the qualities of this scene that can be enhanced using tone? A very important first principle for me in looking at these photos is to work out where is the sunlight coming from, so that whatever brights and darks I introduce into my scene will look like it's coming from the same light source. And here's a trick I use to help me do that more accurately. I manipulate the image in my phone photo app, and I greatly increase the darkness to make the darker areas darker, which then highlights exactly where the sunlight is, where the brightest areas are. Clearly, the side areas of the trees are more in shade than these top areas and the areas towards here. I can see clearly that this left-hand side of the tower has the sunlight hitting it directly, whereas the right side of the tower is in shade. This wall here and this wall here are in direct sunlight, and that the remains of walls attached to the walls here are also catching the light. If our reference photo is taken on a bit of a grey day where the contrasts aren't so bright, it can be really helpful to get an accurate view of where the sunlight is and where the lights and darks are. Because I'm using markers monochromatically, only using various strengths of the one colour, it is in effect a black and white effect that I'm going for. So sometimes I print the photo in black and white, and this can be very helpful for showing us the correct value of the local colour. So for instance, it can be difficult looking at this photo to work out, well, how dark should this light green be versus this light stone colour, or this light green in relation to this darker stone colour. By taking the colour out of our photo, it gives us the answer. The other important point is to work out what contrasts between light and dark I want to emphasise. See, I'm not bound by this. One of the great things about drawing is that you can enhance or minimize certain areas or effects. Contrasts attract attention. It's one of the tools we can manipulate to create visual interest in our drawing, to cause the viewer's eyes to roam from part to part. Let's start by having a quick look at our markers. Here's the sketch marker I'm going to use, the Copic Sketch. Let me say right now, this video is not sponsored in any way by Copic, but I'm always being asked what materials I'm using, and Copic sketch markers are the ones I use for my tone work. What I like about them is that there are two choices. There's the brush end, which has a very slight flexibility, and there's the chisel end. I've never used the chisel end. I find that the brush end just has a nice effect. And a very helpful piece of equipment is to make a little colour chart of the tones we have available for that initial planning stage of our applying tone. Because one of the first things we need to do is to work out how dark will our darkest tone be and how light will our lightest tone be. Obviously, we have the white of the paper that we can use as well. So when I'm looking at this, I'm assuming that this left side of the tower, which is being struck directly by sunlight, I will leave white, as well as the strong white local colour of this. The darkest point is really in this corner and down here. And I'm going to use, I think, N6 for that. The other significant tone to apply will be the right-hand side of this tower. At the moment, I'm not sure between N0 and N1, so I'm going to use N0 at first because I can always apply N1 over the back. At the start, it's best to be a little bit tentative with our tones. Usually we have greater confidence and a greater ability to choose the best ones straight off when more of our paper is covered tonally. The other thing to try and avoid is too many mid-value tones of the one colour next to each other, because they actually make it harder to distinguish the various elements. And having darker tones behind helps to pop forward whatever the lighter tone is. So it's playing with all these little visual tricks to strengthen the actual shape of the image, but also, as I said earlier, to create visual drama. A whole lot of mid-grade tones together tends to blur into one and not encourage us to see the parts. Let's start. So that's my initial work using an N6. Now I'm switching to an N5 just to soften a bit of that contrast in the areas which are still very dark. I've kept my darkest tone really just for this area and for this area here to help push out the spire from the background. And I've used my second darkest tone for the darker parts of the buildings that are further back than these trees are, because darker tones come forward as well, and I want these buildings to have a sense of sitting further back than these trees. And while making these dark areas doesn't quite line up with my reference, it works better, I believe, for the effect in my drawing. Always do what looks good. So now I'm thinking I want to put a light tone in so that I establish the extremes of the drawing. I'll use the N0. Now I'm going to do the stonework with an N1 to make it a bit darker than what I've just done. Here's my N1. I'm going to leave this one lighter and this wall lighter because they're in the full sunlight. I have darker bands where there's shadow being cast by the bouncing light, and also where there's staining of the stonework. I'm going to go with a 4, I think. Here's a 4. So the pens, the reason my pens are so dirty is because when I refill them with the ink, I'm sometimes a bit careless in how I do that. While I've got my 4, I'm also looking at this building over here. Now also I need to use my 4 in the foliage. And I've decided I'm going to have all of the foliage with some tone because that will help to define it as being different to the tower. So it's clearly a darker value than this one, so that's a 0. So I'll start with a 1. I may even come over that heavier with a 2, but in the meantime I'll get a 3 and I will just work a little more of this foliage. And now a 2. And I'm going to do a 2 on the front of this sign. I'm increasing the darks surrounding this signpost to help it stand out more. And now I'll use the 3 on these windows. But the question now is how we're going to do this stonework down here. And I think I'm going to use tone to pick out some of the darker stones because that's the effect we have in our reference. And I'm going to start using a 2 for that. Now I can already see that that's not going to be dark enough, so I'll switch to the 3. Now looking at this, I'm feeling that this needs a little more contrast, so I'm actually going to use the 2 in some parts. The trick is to suggest the stonework without it all becoming just a bit too spotty. But I am going to use a 4 just to get a few darker contrast happening as well. And then we reach a point where we stop and have a look and say, what adjustments do I need to do? I'm not happy that I've used the same value, the same marker for these two shadowy shapes, because this one still has more light on it, so it should be a bit lighter. Now I can't change that. The only thing I can play with is I can make these ones darker if I want, and I think I might, to see how that goes. A lot of this is experimentation and simply making the best choice we can. And then need to look and see what we're doing to make this tower stand out more. And I realize the local color of this framing of this story of the building is actually quite dark, which will suit me well. So I've used a 2 there, so I need to use at least a 3, if not a 4 there, but they're only small spots, so I'll use the 3 first, and I'll only go darker than that if that's not enough. And I might just use a 5 for the darker part of that. Yeah, so hopefully that pushes both sides of the tower out a little bit. So my rule is whatever marker I use on the shaded side of the spire, I use a lighter one in the corresponding section on the lighter side of the spire. So it's keeping the relative difference between the two sides of the spire the same. Now I might use a 0 along here. Again, this is where we stand back and we look and we think, are there areas I want to create a stronger contrast? I was going to do something here, wasn't I? I'll use the 5. And I think that works better for just being a little bit noticeably darker than on this side. You'll notice I've been very light using tone on these figures down here because I don't want to draw attention to them. I didn't do this hedge as dark as it is in the reference photo because I really want the attention to sit up here. All of this really is providing cityscape context for the focal point, which is this beautiful undamaged spire. I'm thinking I'd like to go a little bit darker down here without getting bogged down in detail in the stonework. So, yep, I'm happier with that. Here we have our wren spire. What I've tried to do is to manipulate the tones to emphasize what I want to be the focal point, to make clearer the points of interest with that focal point, but also to add a credible context, in this case, trees, pedestrians, and buildings, which come across as what they're meant to be, but without attracting too much attention away from the focal point. I hope you noticed there was a lot of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, making adjustments, because we really read the values of the tone choices we make against other values. So how dark this is depends on how light the lights are around it. Remember, always try to avoid too much mid-tone next to each other. It just makes it harder to understand what's happening with the lines. And particularly if we're on location, it's a really quick way to bring a drawing further forward. Grab your markers, go and have some fun applying the tone. I'm Stephen Travers. If you've got to this point and you haven't subscribed yet, please do hit notifications. I try and post several videos a week, so don't miss when they come out. Let YouTube tell you. Have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.